The windows were fogged with the train's warmth against the cool night outside, on the line from Taunstein to Berchtesgaden, and I wiped my vision clear to see better, my hand warm from the heating, pressed against the cold glass. A valley lay there, one I knew, a valley I'd known in my youth, but hadn't seen in years, decades. A valley that had known me. A valley I'd explored when I was young, with different eyes, with a different heart. With a heart that hadn't yet carried so much sorrow. And in that moment, as the first ray of light crept over the mountains, faint still, just enough to see, as the sky began slowly to open, like a flower turning to the light, something happened that words can scarcely capture. The invisible became visible. The silence came alive. The night became day. The valley, it was as though it were waking. Not like a man who stretches and yawns, but something far gentler, far older. Like a giant opening its eyes after 1,000 years' sleep. Like the earth itself turning back toward the sun. The meadows were dark green, nearly blue-black still in shadow. They looked like sorrow, like the color of farewell, like the color of things that suffer in the night. But where the light touched, they became green like emerald, like precious stones, like the green that God saw when he made the earth, original green, before all life. Very slowly, not all at once, but like a quiet remembering, like a memory calling itself back, the light crept in, like a mother's hand waking her child, with gentleness, with love, without haste. And the trees, the firs and spruces, those dark centuries, now gleamed like bronze, like old altars, like sacred things, like witnesses revealing themselves. Every needle visible, glinting, awake. Each needle was proof that the night was past, that life had moved on. There was no sound but the train, and the train didn't care that it was sunrise. The train rattled on, ta-dum, 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 regular as a heartbeat, like the breathing of life itself, whilst the valley slowly showed itself to the sun. The train knew no awe, no wonder, no sympathy. The train is a machine that simply carries on, always forward, whether the world changes or not. But I felt everything. And then I saw it, a stream I hadn't expected. Quite fine, quite silver, a brook flowed through the meadow, like a thread, like a vein, like the lifeblood of the world holding the valley alive. And the light reflected in it like 1,000 little mirrors, like 1,000 little eyes watching the sun, 1,000 little dreams dreaming of light. I knew that this brook flowed every day. For millennia this brook has flowed, but without the light, I would never have noticed it. That's grace, you see. Light shows what was always there, what we never saw because we didn't know we could look. A minute passed, then another, and slowly, like a hand opening, like an eye opening after long sleep, the sun climbed higher. The shadows grew smaller, less frightening, less threatening. The darkness retreated into the corners, into the valleys, until it disappeared completely. The blue of the sky emerged, a blue that was always there, that I couldn't see in the darkness. A blue so pure, so vast, that it hurt to look into it, that it touched my soul. And there, I saw it. A house. Only one house, quite small, in a corner of the valley. So small it looked like a toy house from far away. A red roof, shining red in the new sun, white walls, and smoke from the chimney. Delicate smoke rising into the morning air like a prayer. The smoke was so thin, so tender, as though a person were breathing out their soul. It didn't seem quite real, more like a memory, but I knew it was real. Someone had lit that fire, had lit it with love. Solid, real, a person lived there, existed there. I knew there was someone, a person who was rising now, perhaps from bed, perhaps from sleep, just shortly after the long night, who was perhaps making coffee, coffee that smells of morning, of hope, of new life, who was looking out their window, perhaps the same window I was looking at, and seeing the same sun, the same golden moment, understanding that they weren't alone, that someone from far away, from a train, could see them, could perceive them, could acknowledge their existence. The train slowed down, not because the driver had noticed anything, not because there was a signal on the line, but because the train itself understood. This is a place where you should pass more slowly, a sacred place, a place that demands slowness, a place that demands reverence. And I leaned my face very close to the window, fogged with condensation, and I wiped it away with my hand, slowly, carefully, and breathed in. The cold glass rim against my cheek, cold and awake, like a touch from another world. The scent of fur, of damp earth, of something sweet I couldn't name, couldn't grasp. Perhaps mountain flowers, small blossoms that grew only here. Perhaps only the secret of the mountains themselves, the essence of the fact that these places are older than people, older than time, older than thought. And in that moment, the strangest thing happened, the most indescribable thing. I no longer knew whether I was the man looking out the window, or whether I was the valley looking at the man. The boundary disappeared. The dividing wall between inside and outside dissolved like snow in the sun. And everything was one. The train and I, the valley and the sun, the small house and the person making coffee inside it. Perhaps a woman, perhaps a man, probably old like me. The brook, the trees, the smoke from the chimney. Everything was a single body, a single life, a single heart beating. We were all together in that one moment, in that one place, without difference, without boundary. And I was no longer alone. I was home. After all the years, after all the travels, I was finally home. The train accelerated again, slowly, reluctantly, as though it too didn't want to go, as though it too clung to the valley, as though it too understood that something sacred had just passed. And the valley disappeared behind us. The little house, the red roof, the stream flowing like silver, the person making coffee who didn't know someone was seeing them. All of it disappeared into the distance, became a dream, became a memory. But the impression remained, very strong, very warm, very real, as though it lived in my body, a seed of grace, a seed that might grow for the rest of my life. I leaned my head back against the window. The night outside was past. The sun was now completely above, ruling the landscape like a golden queen, triumphant and gentle all at once. But my eyes were so heavy, so content, so filled with everything I'd seen. The rhythm of the train, ta-dum, ta-dum, was like the breathing of the mountains themselves, like the heart of the earth, alive and beating and singing an eternal song of existence. And I followed that breath into sleep that had no boundaries, warm and infinite, and full of light, full of grace, full of the knowledge that I had seen what only few see, that I had been part of it, that I am part of it, and that this was enough, that this was everything. On the line from Cluj to Sighisoara, one December evening when the snow began to fall, thick flakes drifting down like feathers from the sky, I met an old woman in my compartment who was spinning wool. Just like that, from her bag she pulled out a spinning wheel, an old thing folded quite small, wood and metal, that she carried with her always, like a sanctuary, like a sacred relic you couldn't leave behind. She was small, bent over, her spine curved from decades of spinning, from decades, perhaps from centuries, with a stooped back. Her skin was like parchment, thin, delicate, nearly transparent, so you could see the veins, blue lines like a map of her life. And her hands were always in motion, quick, precise, competent, familiar with every aspect of the work. Not nervous, not trembling, but like part of the machine itself, like water turning a millstone, inevitable, irresistible. She told me she came from a village deep in the Carpathians. She spoke the name Hagyach, but it meant nothing to me. A name from another world, a name that sounded like wind in pine trees, like wolves howling in the distance. I asked how long she'd lived there, and she laughed, a laugh that sounded like ice splitting, like water freezing, separating from stone, a laugh that spat out the weight of time. She said, "I was born there on a cold January day, -30 degrees, wolves howling in the mountains, and my mother put me straight to the spinning wheel. Not from cruelty, no, but from necessity, from love, from understanding that life there only exists if you work. Because the wool was our life. The wool warms you. The wool sells at market, brings money, brings survival, brings possibility. The wool speaks in a language older than words, older than thought." The spinning wheel turned, faster, slower, faster, regular as a heartbeat, and the grey wool grew thin as hair, like a thought, then thick as cord, like rope you can hold, that holds life. She showed me how to change the tension through the pressure of your fingers, through instinct, through feel, through a lifetime of experience, through decades of work. "Every animal that gave this wool taught me something," she said, her eyes very focused on the turning spindle, as though the spindle were the whole world. "The sheep taught me to wait. They wait for spring, for new grass, with patience, without complaint, without tears. The wind and rain taught me to stand firm, to stand in the cold, not break, not weep, but simply to be, The winter taught me everything. That survival is a form of beauty. That suffering can also be a form of dignity. She told me about her village, how small it was, how old, how dark in winter when the snow was 2 meters high and the village was cut off from the rest of the world. But how the people huddled together in their houses to stay warm, to avoid freezing, to keep from going mad. A village of perhaps 100 people, perhaps fewer now, all related to one another, all with wool in their hands, all speaking that one language the spinning wheel and the threads spoke. And the wool became the medium between people, the thread that held them together. The grandmothers taught the granddaughters, sitting at the spinning wheel, showing with their hands, no words, only movement, only example, the power of action. The mothers made blankets for newborns, each blanket a blessing, a protection, proof that the child belonged to the village, that it was welcomed. The girls embroidered their wedding clothes with patterns their grandmothers had shown them, patterns centuries old that told stories of love, of survival, of hope in dark nights. "But now," she whispered, her voice grew even smaller, even older, as though speaking through thick snowfall, through millennia. "I travel to my granddaughter in the city, Sigishora. She doesn't know how to spin. She thinks it's old, impractical, something for museums, forgotten. Her mobile phone does the same thing, she thinks. It produces threads of information, of connection, of digital patterns that are forever fast. She doesn't understand that a mobile phone is only fast, breathless. It gives you no time, no silence, no depth, no opportunity to find the rhythm, to understand the rhythm. But the spinning wheel is patience. It's meditative. It's prayer. The spinning wheel speaks the language of waiting and becoming, of learning through repetition. It transforms sheep into wool. It transforms time into cloth. It transforms my hands into history. That's something a mobile phone can never do. It cannot teach patience. The train crossed the mountains, and outside everything was snow. Deep snow that made the world simple, democratic. No differences anymore. Just white and grey and deep blue in the shadows. Just silence. Numbing silence. And the old woman spun on. Her hands grew slower, as though the snow were slowing them, as though the beauty outside demanded she slow down, was pulling her into its rhythm. And I saw that she wasn't really spinning to make yarn, that she had no goal, no deadline, no reason except the reason itself. She spun to calm herself, to keep a rhythm, to maintain a connection with all those who'd taught her. With her grandmothers 100 years back and more, with her mothers, with her sisters, with all the generations of women whose hands had moved exactly like these hands, in exactly this way. She wasn't alone. She was connected with hundreds of women, now dead, but alive in her movements. Before Sigishwara, as the train began to slow, as the first lights of the city came into view, she leaned toward me, and she gave me a piece of wool. A small piece, hardly bigger than my palm. It was so fine, so soft. It was like a bird's feather, like air you could hold, like a prayer you could grasp. "This is from my first spindle," she said, her eyes very distant, very old, as though looking into the past, as though the past still lived in her eyes. 1952. I was 10 years old. The mountain was snow-covered like now, like always in winter. The war was over, but the cold remained. The poverty remained. The hunger remained. And I spun to avoid freezing, to help my mother, to survive, to show I was useful. This wool remembers. It carries the memory of a girl who spun to forget the world outside, to keep herself warm. The train slowed. The city came. Lights, civilization, modernity, fast cars and mobile screens, and people walking quickly. And the old woman packed her spinning wheel away again, very tenderly, the way you'd wrap a baby, the way you'd treat something sacred. She stood up slowly, like a tree stretching after decades of standing, after decades of spinning. And then she disappeared on the platform, into the snowfall, a small figure, dark against the white, vanishing into the snowy city. The last weaver, I thought, the last bearer of this ancient tradition. I held the wool still in my hand, and without knowing why, I pressed my cheek against it. It was warm. It was very warm, as though life still lived in it, as though the warmth of those hands still dwelt there 70 years later, still warm from the work. The train stood still for a moment, as though showing respect, showing sorrow before a civilization coming to an end, before a world that disappears. And then I too left the compartment, following the example of a woman who carried her grandmother in every spin, in every movement, in every fiber of wool that lived through a century. On the line from Regensburg to Passau, one spring morning, when the lilac was just beginning to bloom, that glorious scent, you see, the sort that's both joy and sorrow all at once, announcing spring and reminding you of goodbyes all in a breath. I noticed an old gentleman in my compartment studying a timetable. Not a current one, mind you, but a timetable that was yellowed and brittle, perhaps 20 or 30 years old, maybe older. The pages all dog-eared at the corners, like old letters you've read 1,000 times until they're nearly transparent. His hands were small and thin, with long fingers. The hands of a pianist, perhaps, or someone who'd spent decades learning to bear pain with gentleness. And he read that timetable the way you'd read a poem, slowly, repeatedly, as though each number held meaning, sacred meaning, as though each time, each station held a story, a secret worth keeping. I couldn't contain my curiosity. I asked him why he needed such an old timetable when there were modern mobiles and the internet. GPS, real-time information, everything at your fingertips. He smiled, the sort of smile that said he'd had this question 100 times before, from children, from grandchildren, from fellow travelers, and it never tired him out. As though explaining, sharing, telling the timetable story was the only thing that kept him alive, the only connection he still had to everything. And he told me, very quietly, "This isn't a timetable. It's a letter. My wife wrote it for me before she died, in her own hand. You see, these tiny marks, that's her handwriting. The handwriting I read my whole life long. She marked the routes we traveled together, every train, every day, every place where she said something I should never forget. Each mark is a moment. Each fold is a memory." The train ran along a long, straight stretch, the Danube green and quiet beside us, like an old secret, and the first fruit trees were blooming white as snow, like little miracles at the river's edge. Cherry trees, I suppose, returning each year. That scent, that spring scent that reminds you of everything, that makes it all ache at once. He showed me the marks, not with a pen, but with tiny dog-eared folds in the paper's corners. Folds decades old. Folds that his hands and hers had made together. "That's Linz," he said, and his eyes grew bright, as though he were there again, in that moment, 50 years back or more. We got out, and she bought 2 apples at the station. She wanted to give me one. She told me, "The apples taste better here because they know who's eating them." And I said, "That's madness. That's absurd. A woman philosophizing about apples, speaking to fruit about life." He laughed quietly, a laugh that traveled through time. But you see, she was right. The apples tasted better, not because the station was better, but because she was my wife, and we were together. Love. That's what makes the apples taste better. That's what makes everything better. It's the only alchemy I know. Other marks. Passau, he whispered, and his voice was very quiet now, as though he were entering a sanctuary, as though each word might do violence. There we asked ourselves if we wanted children. We talked about it for whole nights, under blankets, whilst the train carried us. What it would mean. And we decided, no. Not because we couldn't, not from selfishness, not from fear, but because we knew we had enough, that our love was already complete, that a child, it might only complicate things or fragment them. Some people can't understand that, especially not back then in the 1970s when everyone expected couples to have children. But she understood. She said, "We have each other. That's already everything, more than enough." And still other marks. Regensburg, Vienna, Salzburg, Budapest. Each one a sentence, a moment, a conversation that had changed him forever. A sentence from her, an observation, laughter in the night, a dream she'd shared with him while the train rattled beneath them. All of it, everything, folded into this old timetable, this letter that he carried like a priest carries his breviary, like a believer carries sacred texts. I watched as he held that timetable, so carefully, so tenderly, as though it were a bird's egg, something alive, something that would break if you weren't careful. His hands trembled slightly. That was right. That was proper. Truth ought to tremble. Love ought to tremble. And I understood something in that moment. Something fundamental about life. We all carry letters. Not always on paper. Sometimes in our thoughts, read every day. Sometimes in our hands, worn thin, warm with life, with touch. Sometimes in an old timetable that most people would throw away as though it were nothing. Rubbish, old, worthless, meaningless. But this man understood something most people have lost. He understood the sacred logic of love. He understood that every object carries history, that a timetable isn't just numbers and stations, but held a life inside it. Not just love, not just memory, but everything, compressed into paper and ink. This man, he wasn't mad. He was something better. He was illuminated. He was with his wife. She was everywhere, in every mark, in every fold, in every moment of the journey, on every page. She still lived, in his hands, in his eyes, in this old timetable, which was like a body that still carried them both. The man apologized eventually and said he had to get out at Deggendorf. That's not on the direct route from Regensburg to Passau, but he said it wasn't far, and he wanted to be at a place today where he'd been with her. A place where they'd been together once, where they'd had a picnic, or simply got out to breathe the air. We shook hands, and his hand was warm and small, like the hand of someone who knows time is limited, that moments are precious. And he gave me the timetable to read. Just one page, the route Regensburg to Passau. And at the top, in very fine handwriting, it said, "The most important thing isn't where the journey goes. The most important thing is who sits beside you." It was her handwriting. I could feel it. The handwriting of a woman who loved, who understood everything, who knew what mattered, who distilled it all into a few words. Her essence, her wisdom, her whole love on one page of an old timetable. I gave him the timetable back, and he tucked it very gently into his jacket pocket over his heart, the right place, where the heart beats, where love lives, where memory dwells. The train slowed, and he stood up very slowly, as though his body were heavy with years and sorrow and love that cannot end. And as he left the compartment, he whispered to me, "Thank you for listening. That's what matters, that people listen, that they bear witness, that they understand we're not alone, that we all carry these letters." And I nodded. The train rattled on, ta-dum, ta-dum, regular as a heartbeat still alive, and I was alone. But the Danube was still beside me, green and endless, and the trees were still blooming white, like snow, like hope, like love that doesn't die. And I understood that I'd been given a message, a precious message, that every journey is a letter, that every route is a sentence that means something, that every love survives in these little folds, these dog-eared marks, these secret alphabets that only lovers can read. And slowly, as the river passed by, my eyes grew very heavy, and I fell asleep with a smile I couldn't explain, but that was right, that meant everything. On the line from Fulda to Bad Hersfeld, on a spring day, one of those days when the world is ready to wake, when the buds were just beginning to break, red and green, full of potential, full of promise, and the world was stirring from its long sleep, stretching, feeling spring coming alive. There sat across from me an old man with a book in his hand. Not just any book, not a modern newspaper or a paperback for the train journey, but a battered, worn, beloved Bible, so old that the pages were yellowed like old teeth, like ivory, like something that had long lain beneath the earth, seen light, been handled thousands of times. He was tall. Perhaps he had once been taller, before age compressed him, but bent now like a tree that no longer stands straight, no longer fights against gravity, but still bears life, still lives, still has leaves in this spring. His eyes were blue like the sea after a storm, clear and profound, deep blue, as if God had written with color, with that sort of depth, that sort of wisdom you only find in people who have lived long, very long, and seen much, seen too much, and survived it, understood it. Around his neck he wore a thin silk scarf, white, or what had become white after it faded, after the light left it, after time had touched it, and the sun, and the years. He wasn't really reading, not with concentration, not with effort, but kept glancing out the window, as if the words in his book and the landscape outside together formed one great poem, together told a story, a long story that only he could understand, that only he had spent a lifetime reading. I asked him carefully, respectfully, whether he was a clergyman, whether he belonged to a church, whether he worked somewhere, or whether he simply traveled. He laughed softly, not bitterly, not cynically, but with a laugh that sounded like water, like rain, like all gentle, pleasing things. A laugh like water in the desert. "No," he said, and his gaze was grateful, peaceful. "I'm a wandering preacher. That means I have no church, no walls, no stone, no parish, no place where you can find me, no salary, no monthly check, no security, no pension. The whole world is my church. Trains, like this one, railway stations, waiting rooms, park benches, bus shelters. Everywhere people are tired and sitting quietly. Everywhere people are lonely. There I preach. There I speak of grace. I'm not official. The church hasn't ordained me. The church doesn't know me. The church isn't interested in me. But I know the church. I know it everywhere, in every train, in every heart that's open." He told me, slowly, thoughtfully, as if sharing a secret, that for 50 years he'd been working on the same preaching theme, that his whole life long, 50 years, he'd held to the same message, that he'd never preached on anything else, never changed to another subject. Grace. Grace, grace, grace. Not theological grace, not that complicated thing from schools and disputations and academic debates, but everyday grace, invisible grace, the grace that carries you, that holds you, that saves you every day. The grace that the train offers you, saving you from rain, from cold, from loneliness, saving you from a cold platform, from the night, from despair. The grace that snow falls, for no reason, with no expectation, with no reward, and shows you how clean the world can be, how innocent, how fresh and new, as if everything were just being born. The grace that old people like me give you time, precious time, perhaps the last time, to listen, to see a face, to know you're not alone, that someone is there. "In 50 years, he said quietly, his voice barely audible now above the rattle of the train, and his gaze grew even more distant, even older, even deeper. Like looking into an old well and not seeing the bottom, I've kept coming back to this one sentence, like a child who hears a story and asks for it again and again. And I've never grown tired of it, never understood all of it. The world gives you more than you've ever deserved. That's not justice. Justice is too narrow, too thin, too much arithmetic. That's not compassion. Compassion is something you've earned if you've been good. That is grace. That is undeserved goodness, simply given. That is the generosity of the world, falling upon you like rain, not because you're worthy of it, but because the world is generous. Generous for no reason, generous without cause. "I've preached in churches," he said, and it sounded like a memory, a time that's past. Beautiful churches, old churches, churches with organs that sound like God himself. The stone warm from the prayers of hundreds of years, of thousands of years. People who prayed, hoped, wept, loved, but the people there, they already know they're saved, or they don't believe it. And my preaching doesn't change that, not really. My voice is one among many, lost in all the stone and the history. But here, he gestured to the windows, the Hesseland windows, the spring windows, at the young meadows, the buds, the fields turning green with new strength. Here are people who aren't sure, who doubt, who don't know. A businessman who's frightened of tomorrow, deeply frightened, of bankruptcy, of loss, of meaninglessness. A woman who's lost her son and no longer knows who she is, no longer knows why she lives. A child who doesn't know who it is, where it's going, what the future holds. A child frightened, like we all are. And I sit beside them, and I don't speak grand words, don't quote long passages from the Bible they won't understand, don't offer theological concepts. I simply say, quietly, gently, look out the window. The snow is falling, or the blossoms are falling, depending when we're traveling, depending what season it is. Nobody deserves snow, but we have it. The tree has no right to turn green, to bloom, to live, but it does turn green. That's grace. You there, don't deserve to live, haven't earned it, but you do live. That's everything. That's the only thing that really counts. The train accelerated, slowly, steadily, through the spring Hesseland, through meadows, through villages, through forests. The buds became real, not thought, but reality. Bloomed open, burst forth, showed their colors, red, orange, white, green. Life broke from the earth, green, unbidden, undeserved by the earth, unearned by the plants, but simply there, like a blessing, like a gift no one ordered, no one had earned. The wandering preacher looked down at his tattered Bible, the Bible that had been his whole life, that had been his traveling companion, that had been his truth. My son, well, he's about your age, around 60, 70, once asked me years ago whether I wasn't tired of saying the same thing over and over, saying it in 100 different trains, to 100 different faces, to 100 different human hearts, year after year, decade after decade, always the same, always grace, always grace. And I said, and I still say it, no, my son, not because the subject doesn't tire you, everything tires you, even truth tires you, but because grace never tires you. Grace is the only thing that grows softer with each repetition, not harder, not duller. Every time I say it, I understand it better. Every time a stranger, like you now, listens to me and a smile comes to their face, when their eyes grow soft, when the fear leaves, I receive this grace myself. I take it with me, and it carries me a little further, a little lighter, a little closer to God. As the train drew near Bad Hersfeld, we were almost there. The wandering preacher grew quiet, still, meditative, like a man who has lived his life, done his work, who is ready for what comes. His book lay on his lap, closed now, like a prayer that's finished, that's been said, that has reached God. The Bible, warm from his hand, warm from his soul. His hands were folded, not in tension, not in prayer, but naturally, as if cradling himself, as if comforting himself, as if all the love of the world were concentrated on one single person, and that person were himself. The train fell into its rhythm, clack, 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 and the buds rushed past, so tiny in this vast world, so insignificant in size, and yet all grace, all blessing, all the gift of what is given undeservedly, for no reason, without cause, without reward. And I thought of grace, of all the times I'd been given more than I deserved, when life gave to me, not because I was good, but because the world is generous. Of the train carrying me, bearing me away, bearing me home. Of the old man sitting beside me telling me of grace, who'd devoted his life to grace. Of the spring that comes, not because I ordered it, not because I deserved it, but simply there, just there. And my eyes grew heavy, 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 grateful heavy, gratefully tired, grateful for this grace. And I fell asleep with the certain knowledge, with the sacred, sure knowledge, that the world gives me more than I ever deserve, gives more than I ever need, and that's good, and that's enough, and that's everything, that's truly everything that I'll ever need. On a train from Milan to Como, early one summer morning, when the air was already warm, not pleasantly warm, but southern warm, the kind that comes from lands where the sun doesn't negotiate, and smelled of southern things, strong things, of warm old stone, of citrus, of life that breathes faster, that speaks louder, that burns. I met a young girl. She might have been 10, perhaps 13, that impossible age when children aren't quite adults and yet aren't quite children anymore, if you understand what I mean. If you've ever been young, if you still remember that crossing, between innocence and knowledge, between play and seriousness. She wore a white dress, snow-white linen, far too fine for a train journey, far too elegant, far too carefully chosen, as if she were dressed for a great celebration when all she was doing was traveling, only going from Milan to Como, a short journey, unremarkable. And yet for this girl it was clearly important, manifestly important. And on her table sat a small tortoise, no bigger than a fist, compact, absorbed in itself, with a shell smooth and brown like polished wood, like something that might be 1,000 years old, that could be 1,000 years old, that could survive 1,000 years. I asked her, carefully, respectfully, about the tortoise, about this strange, curious, precious companion on a train journey. She looked at me, really looked, with her full gaze, and her eyes were large and serious. The eyes of an old person in a young body, not the eyes of a child at play, but the eyes of someone who has observed for a long time, who already understands much, who knows more than a child ought to know, who is old, old on the inside. "This is Stella," she said very quietly, quieter than children usually are, quieter, older, more thoughtful. "She's old, older than me, much older, older than my grandmother. She's lived longer than my grandmother lived. My grandfather got her long before I was born. I've known Stella my whole life, or Stella was already there, already part of the family. He had her for nearly 40 years, 40 years of love, 40 years of responsibility, 40 years of daily food, daily water, daily this quiet presence. And now I'm getting her, because the family says grandfather will die soon. They want Stella to have a new family, someone who loves her, truly loves her, not just feeds her. Someone ready to understand her, someone who has the time, tortoise time, the slowness, the understanding." She stroked the tortoise very lightly, barely visible, barely a movement, just one finger over the shell, not forcefully or strongly, not grasping, not clutching, but as light as a breath, like a feather, like light, as if she were weighing the trust, the weight of this touch, the sacredness of this moment. "My grandmother says a tortoise is a keeper of time." Yes, literally, that's what she told me. She sees days come, and days become weeks, and weeks become years, and years become a life, a whole life, just observing, just being, just existing. Stella has become so old, has lived so long, because she's never in a hurry, because she doesn't have this guilt-driven rush, this modern sickness that torments people, that tears them apart. She lives in this other time, tortoise time, where each moment is exactly as it should be, not faster, not slower, not shorter, not longer, not past, not yet to come, but simply now. Where patience isn't a virtue, isn't something you practice, but a breath, a heartbeat, a way of being. The girl stared out the window, lost in thought, towards the Alps, which were blue in the distance like a dream, like a promise of something vast, something eternal, something old and immovable that will always be there, long after we're all gone. "My grandfather was like the train," she said softly, thoughtfully. with a sadness that wasn't her sadness, but the sadness of the world, the sadness of aging, of dying. Fast, always on the go, everywhere. Always something to do, something to build, something to change, something to improve, something to make. His heart was fast, his hands were fast, his mind was fast. But the tortoise, Stella, she teaches you to be different. She doesn't teach it actively, not consciously, but simply through her being, through her presence. She teaches you that there are other ways to live, other paths, other rhythms, other purposes. Not better and not worse. The problem with my grandfather was he always thought his way was better. Just different. A different rhythm. Ta-dam, ta-dam. Slow, not fast. A different tempo. The tortoise's beat, not the human beat. A different understanding of what matters. Not how much you do, but how you do it. Not how fast, but how deeply. The train wound through the Italian landscape like an animal that knows the way, that has traveled this route 1,000 times. Villas with flowers, fiery red blooms, rose-pink flowers, church spires, old and sacred, towers pointing up to God, lakes lying like mirrors reflecting the Alps, everything doubled, everything mirrored. When grandfather dies, the girl said suddenly, and her voice grew even quieter, even more serious, even older, an old voice in a young body, a voice that knows too much. I'll be alone with Stella, and that's good. That's not sad, or it is sad, but it's also right, also possible, also acceptable. Sometimes people aren't enough. You need something quiet, something that doesn't speak, which I do too much of, that doesn't expect anything, that doesn't demand answers, that doesn't cling to you desperately with words and questions and love that's too heavy. Something that simply sits beside you, the way Stella sits beside me now, here on this table, still, silent, present. The way Stella sat beside my grandfather for 40 years. And that's enough. That's quite enough. That's already a kind of love, a different kind than human love. No words, no feelings, no expectations, but not less real, not less important, not less sacred, not less true. I regarded the girl and the tortoise, truly regarded them, not merely saw, but understood with my whole body, my whole soul. And it was as if I were seeing two old souls in the young body and an old, ancient shell. Perhaps the girl was already old, old inside, wise with age, an old spirit in the young face. Perhaps the tortoise had always been small, small from the start, and had stayed small, not from lack, but from choice, from wisdom. The train moved onwards, through Italy, through the summer heat, through the mountains. The girl opened a small white cloth, carefully, lovingly, and showed me salad. Not just any salad, but tiny, tender leaves, green as hope, and a few small strawberries, red and sweet and precious, which she'd carefully brought along for the tortoise, carried, guarded, protected on the journey. I give her the same food every day, she said, as if this were a sacred task, a task that mustn't be forgotten. She loves it. Order, continuity, repetition. Change frightens her, deeply frightens her, existentially frightens her. The unknown, the new, the unpredictable, that drives all tortoises mad, throws them off balance, out of their safety. But if you show her that tomorrow will be exactly like today, that the food will be exactly the same, that your face will be exactly the same, that the world is stable, then she grows calm, then she can sleep, then she can trust that the world isn't chaos, that things don't change, that she's safe, that I'm here, that love is reliable. As the train drew near Como, we were almost there, the journey nearly done. The girl grew quieter, even more still than before, like an ice statue, like something preparing itself. She lifted the tortoise very gently, with both hands, carefully, the way you hold a sacred wafer, and pressed her against her chest, against her white linen dress. Not the gesture of a child playing with a pet and delighted, not that. but the gesture of an old man carrying a precious burden, carrying great responsibility, who understands deeply, completely, that some things are sacred, that some moments are unforgettable, that some kinds of love grant immortality. I watched as she closed her eyes, slowly, thoughtfully, sacredly, as if saying goodbye to her grandfather, as if shortening the whole story, the whole passing on, the whole love in one embrace, concluding it, completing it. The train fell into its rhythm, clack, 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 and the Alps moved outside the window, unmoved, eternal, unchanging, and the lakes reflected the sun back up to the sky, and the summer was everywhere, unasked for, unearned, given like grace. And I thought of time, the time the tortoise has, generations of time, of patience, of understanding, of the sweet, eternal slowness of the tortoise that outlives grandfathers, that outlives people, that outlives generations, that outlives everything humans invent, everything humans love, everything humans lose. And the girl, this wise girl, learning that love doesn't mean hurrying, that life doesn't mean noise, that presence doesn't mean movement, that duration is a blessing, a healing, a grace. And my eyes grew heavy, heavy as time itself, heavy as a life fully lived, heavy as a sleep so deep as the earth that carries the tortoise, so deep as the time the tortoise carries within itself. I met the Pigeon Breeder on the line from Duisburg to Dinslaken on a March afternoon when the sky was still gray from the night's rain, a gray that hung heavy, that pulled at the earth like a weight, and the cold wasn't quite ready to let go of the ground, wasn't quite ready to allow the spring. The air in the carriage was cold and damp, with a hint of rain from outside. He stood for a long time in the doorway as he boarded, a very long time, unusually long, as if he had to take his time deciding whether this train was worthy of his presence, his burdens, his precious responsibilities, his sacred trust. He was small, perhaps 5'5", perhaps less, perhaps age had compressed him, with hair that was gray and white mixed together like old feathers, like the plumage of a bird that had stayed out in the sun too long, that had flown too long, whose feathers were worn thin by movement and time. And in his hands, delicate, almost translucent, like bird bones, like the bones you find in nature, white and thin and sacred, he held a cage, small but beautifully made from dark wood, warm brown like an old church, with carefully carved ornaments, skillfully done, lovingly. Ornaments that showed time, showed love, showed years. He sat down beside me, carefully, considerately, as if each movement mattered, and placed the cage gently on his lap, tenderly, lovingly, the way you hold a baby, the way you hold something sacred, the way you hold trust. The cage was warm, I could feel that from where I sat. Inside it sat a pigeon, gray, not white, not black, but gray like the sky after rain, with a ring around its neck in iridescent blue and green, like a tiny band of rainbow, like light breaking through feathers, like something that glows even when no light strikes it. "This is Mathilde," he said, and his voice became immediately softer, older, more tender, a voice that transformed, that grew younger, that had a heart. "My eldest, 16 years old. For pigeons, that's a very great age, truly unusual, truly rare. Some say pigeons reach 8, 9 years old if you're lucky. But Mathilde is special. Mathilde is not of this world, you might say." His gaze rested on the bird with a kind of reverence, a kind of sacred regard, the way you look at something ancient, something imperishable. I've been breeding pigeons for 50 years, my whole life, really, my whole adult life. My father taught me when I was a boy, only 10 years old. He showed me the pigeons, showed me how to love them, how to understand them. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, in those long nights when you're old, when sleep won't come, I still hear him whistling his little melodies, hear him whistle. That was his signal for calling, That was how he'd bring the pigeons in when they came back from flight, from their adventures in the air, from their freedom. I asked gently why he was carrying this particular pigeon with him, why he hadn't left her in his loft at home, somewhere safe. His gaze grew even softer, as if the light changed, as if the sun sank lower, even further away, even older. "Mathilde was always the fastest," he said slowly, thoughtfully. And it was as if he weren't speaking to me at all, but to the pigeon, as if he were speaking with the bird, or to the past, or to something that hung beyond the window, that floated in the air below, that was everywhere. By the time she was 3, she was already a legend among my birds, the best, the fastest, the most faithful. She could fly, and she was gone, away from my hands, away from my world, away into the vast, infinite air, into the blue, into the distance. And I thought she wouldn't come back, that freedom was stronger than love, that she would choose not to return. But always, always she came back, every time. 158 times she flew away. I kept count, every single time. I kept a journal. 158 times she came back. To me, into my hands, home. Not once did she fail, no promise broken. Only return, constancy, love. Faithfulness, not conditional, not forced. But now she's old, so old, too old to fly. Her wings are still strong. I can see that when I hold her. When I feel the feathers, the muscles are still there, still vigorous. But her heart grows weary, grows wearier with each year. The train and its gentle swaying, it's almost like flying, but safer, more protected, gentler. So I bring her on the journey, a final journey, one last movement before it becomes too much. She shouldn't die alone in my loft, among all the young birds, the new pigeons who can still fly, who can still stretch their wings. She should be reminded that there's still a world out there, that there's still life beyond my room, beyond my hands, beyond the loft. I watched him regarding the pigeon, not merely looking at it, but regarding it with his whole being. And it was as if he weren't looking at just a bird, but at an entire life, an entire universe of sorrow and joy, of flight and return, of faithfulness and longing. His eyes were wet, not with tears, but with moisture, as if something in him were melting. "Do you know what I've learned from all these pigeons?" he asked me suddenly, but he didn't expect an answer. No, he didn't need one. The question was for himself, a rhetorical question. A question cast into space, into the night, into the train, into eternity. He was speaking to himself, to his bird, to you, Mathilde, to the past, to his father, to all the pigeons he'd ever bred. Faithfulness. Faithfulness, not as people understand it, not some stubborn, grim, dutiful thing, not because you must or because there are rules, not from habit or laziness, but a sweet faithfulness, a faithfulness born of love, pure, clean, untainted, from the desire to return, from the longing to come home. The pigeon could stay away if it wanted. It could choose, truly choose, to live a wild life, a free life, with no cage, without me, without this small person, this old person who calls them home with whistled melodies. But every evening, when the sun sets, and that's when the pigeons most want to fly, when the light is still beautiful, when the air is still warm, it remembers. There is someone waiting. There is a home, a place, a safe place where it is welcomed, unconditionally welcomed, no matter how tired it is, how much its wings ache, how old it has become. There is someone, me, who knows its voice, who recognizes its return before it even lands. I know not how, but I recognize it by the wing beat, by the sound of the wings. And it comes back. Always it comes back. Not because it's trapped, no. The loft isn't a prison, it's a home. Because it loves. And that is the greatest wonder I've ever learned. The train picked up speed a little, slowly, gently, a gradual increase in pace, and I watched the Ruhr Valley landscape slip past like a film. Factories, gray and mighty, tracks, countless tracks, industrial architecture, not beautiful but honest, a gray poetry made of steel and stone and labor, people at work, building the world, making things. But in my thoughts, there were only the pigeons, always coming back, always returning home, like the seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter, like the heartbeat, clack, 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 like everything that's sacred, that comes again, that stays. "My daughter," the pigeon breeder said suddenly, his voice even sadder now, even older. "She doesn't understand, can't understand why I still breed pigeons, why I give my whole life to the birds. She says they're not modern, not practical, not profitable. What do those words mean to me? She tells me I should retire, should rest, should stay at home, should come to her and her children, my grandchildren, whom I barely know, who barely know me. But how can I do that to my birds? They depend on me, not emotionally, not the way people are emotional. Pigeons aren't emotional in that way, but practically, existentially. They need food, everyday food, not just any food, but the right food. Water, always fresh water, a clean place to sleep, to rest, to live." He stroked the pigeon once more, tenderly, lovingly, like a farewell, like a parting kiss. "My grandchildren, they won't inherit my pigeons, no, nobody will. When I'm gone, when I've passed, they'll be gone too. They'll scatter, they'll fly off somewhere where people aren't, where they're free, where they can live like wild pigeons, without a cage, without counting, without purpose. That's sad, yes, it's sad for me, but it's also right. It's the way it should be. It's grace." The pigeon stirred, very slightly, very gently, the slightest flutter, and the man ran his hand over its feathers, not stroking, not playing, but acknowledging, the way you greet a friend you haven't seen in ages, whom you recognize, whom you tell, "You're still here, you're still living, I know you." Like a memory you touch, that you hold, that you preserve against forgetting. The train rolled on, clack, 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 steady, sure, inexorable. And the March air pressed against the window, cold, fresh, full of possibility, and the sky was still gray, March gray, the gray of transition. But now I could see the first green shoots, the first signs that spring was coming, that life was ready to come again, that the world was waking. And I thought of return, of how important it is to return, how sacred return is, of homesickness, of the longing for home, of the sweet, bittersweet knowledge that someone is waiting for you, that someone loves you, no matter how long you've been away, no matter how tired your wings are, no matter how old you become. And my eyes grew heavy, heavy as old feathers, heavy as love, heavy as memory. And I was almost a pigeon myself, flying in a distant landscape in a blue world, hovering, free and yet safe, with only one thought, one that repeated itself: "Come home, come home, come home," until sleep, until peace. On the line from Kassel to Marburg, just after midnight, when the world beyond the train window turned black and formless, black as velvet, black as silk, black as sleep itself, there sat across from me an older woman. She was tall, but not upright. Rather, she was settled into herself like a tree that the wind has bent. Her hair was white as snow, not the yellowed white that old hair sometimes turns, but pure white, crystalline white, carefully plaited into a knot, not from vanity, not from pride, but from order, from the need for structure that old women sometimes have when life has grown wild and they need something firm, something they can hold on to, something that stays arranged. On her lap lay an old radio, solid, green, the sort of green that came from the 1950s, with proper buttons from a time when things still had weight, still meant something. When you could reach out and touch them rather than just rushing screens. When you had a conversation with objects instead of a monologue to them. The surface was scratched, worn smooth, loved. Loved so deeply that the scratches looked like marks of affection, proof of devotion. The radio was playing softly. So softly that I thought at first it was just my imagination, only a hum, only the nerves of a night train passenger who's been awake too long, whose ears have grown too sensitive. Then I recognized the voice, a late-night program, some local station, a man with a gentle, warm voice, the sort of voice that sounds old, that's heard a great deal, reading poetry. Old poetry, German classics, the sort you only read when the whole world is sleeping. Hölderlin, Trockel, the voices of the dead, read aloud by an old man's voice for other old people. She turned the volume down a touch further, thoughtful, concentrated, so that the words were barely understandable, barely audible to anyone but her. Only the music beneath to be heard, a sort of humming, a kind of whisper. "Forgive me," she said, without looking up, without meeting my eye directly, though I was sitting right across from her. "I don't like it when it's too loud. The volume, you see, it's too much, too obtrusive, too sharp. But when it's too quiet..." And here she paused, a long pause. "Then I'm alone, completely alone. The train carries me, but I'm alone. And I don't like that anymore, not since... well, not anymore." Her gaze was far away, somewhere in the past, in a place I couldn't see. I asked her, gently, slowly, respectfully, how long she'd been traveling with the radio. Whether it was a daily ritual, whether it was something she always did. She smiled, a quiet smile, not happy, but not quite sad either. The smile of someone remembering something painful, and yet treasuring it because the pain means it was real, that it was truly love. "Since my husband died," she said slowly. "That was 9 years ago. 9 years, 3 months, and 17 days. But who keeps count, eh? I do. I count every day, even when I don't want to, even when I try not to." She looked out the window into the black night, where nothing was visible but black. "We did everything together, watching television, listening to the radio, reading, everything as one. We never kept things separate. The radio sat in the front room, an old thing, older than this one, older than we were, a thing that lasts longer than people. And when he was in the kitchen, cleaning vegetables or making tea, I'd hear the radio from there. The sound would come through to me. When I was in the kitchen, he'd hear the radio from here, from this side of the house. We didn't need to speak. We'd said everything there was to say in 45 years together. 45 years of love and routine and daily life. But we heard each other, through the radio's words, through the music, through the broadcaster's voices. It was a way of being together, a way of being close without looking at one another, a way of loving without speaking. She opened a small plastic bag beside her, carefully, lovingly, as if opening something sacred, and showed me what was inside. It was full of tiny rolled pieces of paper, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. I couldn't count. The sum was too great. "Numbers," she said quietly. "Every night when the program finishes, I write down the number of the broadcast I've listened to, the exact time, 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, the title, the broadcaster's name if I can find it. I write that down too. Sometimes a word that's particularly pleased me, a beautiful word, a word that's touched my heart. A sentence, a whole sentence that's moved me, that's brought tears to my eyes, quietly, here in the compartment, so no one could see. So, as if I had someone to share it with. Someone I could say to, 'Did you hear that? This sentence?' The numbers are like a notebook kept between two people who can't speak to each other anymore, who can't speak. One of them can't speak anymore, but live together. Living together in this strange way that's left when one of you is gone, when one of you has left the world, but the other stays and still needs conversation, still needs communication, still needs the feeling of not being alone. Her fingers were delicate, almost translucent, almost sacred, as she tucked the papers back into the bag, as if she were handling relics, sacred objects, as if she were closing a coffin. 99 broadcast numbers now. I keep count precisely. Every piece of paper, every night, every broadcast, the number grows. Soon it will be 100. 100 is a lovely number. Then I'll exchange this lot for a new book, a new notebook for new numbers, and then we start again from 1, or rather, he and I start again. Like a new marriage, a new chapter. I said nothing for a long time. Minutes passed. The radio played on, softly, steadily, like a heartbeat. The man on the radio, this invisible man, continued reading his poem, unaware, not knowing that he was part of this quiet, loving ritual, that he was a means to an end, that a widow on a night train heard him on the route from Kassel to Marburg, in the depths of the night, and in doing so remembered her dead husband, that she had his face in her mind's eye, that she heard his voice, not the radio broadcaster's voice, but her husband's voice, lurking beneath the broadcaster's voice, like a memory that's always present. "Some people think it mad," the widow said suddenly, her gaze sharp, direct, fixed on me, as if she needed to justify herself, as if she had to defend her truth. "My daughter, she's 60 herself by now, I'd say. She tells me I ought to find a friend my own age, someone to talk to, someone to take walks with around town, to run errands with. But they don't understand, young people don't really. People in their rush, in their hunger for what's new, in their contempt for what's old. I talk far too much. I've always talked too much, told too many stories, asked too many questions. My husband was a quiet man, a listener, someone who heard before he spoke. The radio listens too. It hears me. It doesn't ask for answers, it doesn't demand, it doesn't suggest, it doesn't judge. It simply gives. It just gives and gives. And I receive. I take in the voices, I take in the poetry. It's a dialogue without words, a dialogue of silence, speaking to silence. And that's all I can manage now, all I still need, all that still keeps me alive. The train fell quiet, rolling gently through the night, the wheels rattling on the track. But the train itself was still, gentle, peaceful. And only the radio spoke, whispering now, barely audible, barely loud enough to break the silence. The widow listened, completely absorbed, her whole being concentrated on the voices from the radio, on the poetry, on the dead words speaking alive. I watched her as she listened, how her face changed, how her lips moved as if she were reading, as if she were tasting the words, as if she were speaking with her dead husband through the words, through the mediation of the radio, the man's voice on the radio. And how her face grew peaceful, relaxed, how all the wrinkles, all the lines, all those marks of pain and time grew soft. That was enough. That was more than enough for one night. The rhythm of the train, clack, 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 was like an enormous heart carrying us all. The widow, the radio, her husband who was far away and yet so present in the air, in the music, in the words. My own sorrow that I hadn't yet named, that I carried into this train. All of us together, all of us alone, all of us bound together in the night through memory and radio and love that doesn't die. And as my own eyes grew heavy, heavy as lead, heavy as sleep itself, I could still hear the gentle old voice of the broadcaster, Holderlin now, the final lines. Over all the mountain peaks, peace. And I understood that sometimes love isn't about speaking, isn't about being together, but about listening. Listening to how someone lives, even when they're no longer here. And this listening is a kind of love, a kind of presence, a kind that never ends, that has no conclusion, that only grows deeper with time. I met the Danube Fisherman on a train on the route from Passau to Deggendorf in summer, when the heat still hung everywhere like a damp cloth, and even the distant mountains began to melt. The air in the compartment was heavy and warm, and it smelled of river, of green water, of mud, of all the things that live and die in the water. He sat across from me, a large, broad man with arms like tree branches, brown from the sun, with sinews visible under the skin like the structure of a tree. His hands weren't hardened like some craftsmen's, but smooth, almost delicate, polished by all the years in the water, shaped by the river's gentleness, not its force. He wore an old cap, gray and faded, not from age alone, but from constant contact with sun, rain, and the salty mist of the river. The cloth was soft, like cloth washed 100 times. Under the brim, a pair of green eyes looked at me, green like the water itself. The eyes of someone who gazes longer into the depths than into the sky, who knows the secrets beneath the water better than the cloud pictures above, who thinks with the river instead of with the land. I asked him how long he'd been fishing on the Danube, whether his whole life was this one river. He laughed quietly, not loud laughter, but one that sounded like water flowing gently. The laughter of a man who is satisfied, who knows exactly who he is. 34 years, since I was 16, he said slowly, deliberately, as though weighing every word like a fish. My father taught me, not from books or instruction, but by putting the net in my hand and showing me where to look, not where to look, but how. And his father taught him, and his father before him. 3 generations of Danube men, perhaps 4, perhaps 5, who think like the river, who breathe like the river, who dream of the river, who have become river. They've lived so much in the water. We've been fishermen as long as the Danube flows, and the Danube has flowed since the world was young, since time itself was young. The train swayed slightly round a curve, a gentle roll, almost a waltz step, and from our window I saw the river, blue-green and golden in the sunlight, majestic, slow, endless, vast like a quiet thought, like God's thought if God grew silent. You see, he said, and pointed with one hand to the river, the other resting on his lap like a dove, delicate, quiet. That's my office. That's my home. Not like your home, fixed, secure, always the same everywhere, stiff as stone, dead as stone. My home moves constantly. It changes with every minute, with every light, with every temperature, with every breath. In spring it's wild and fast, almost angry, when the snow in the mountains melts and roars down like an animal that's been caged long. In summer, warm and lazy, slow, sluggish, ready to sleep, like a cat in the sun. In autumn, restless, nervous, turbulent, as though it knows winter's coming, that cold's coming, that life must hide. In winter, most fishermen sleep. We sit in our huts and repair nets, net after net, all winter, and remember the fish, their faces, their ways, the time when they still lived, before we caught them. He told me about his life on the water, how you read fish like a language, how you understand their ways, their desires, their fears, when they weaken and when they're hungry, when they flee and when they're still, when the heat of the day drives them deeper, when evening brings them back to food. Not like in a textbook, which has dead words, stiff illustrations, lifeless rules, but like someone who's concentrated their whole life on this one thing, who studied their thinking like a scholar studies his favorite books, which he's read 100 times and always, always finds something new, deeper meanings, hidden patterns. His voice grew slower, deeper, older. A fish, he said, and his gaze grew even more distant, even older, even deeper, is not stupid. He is just different. He thinks differently than you. Different, not less. You think about tomorrow, about food, about people, about money, about all the things that plague you, that distract you, that tear you apart. The fish only thinks about current, about shadow, about food, about danger, about the next moment, the next breath, the next life. That's all. His whole universe capsulated in these simple thoughts. But in this "that's all" lives a whole life, a whole universe, as complex as your universe, as rich, so full of meaning, so full of wisdom that you'll never understand, that you can only respect. I watched his eyes wander to the window, slowly, deliberately, to the river that flowed beside us like a green snake, endless, patient, unshakable, unstoppable in its flowing. The river that had flowed for millions of years, that would flow for millions more years, whether we fishermen were there or not, whether the boat was there or not. "This river," he said very quietly. So quietly I had to lean forward to hear him, to understand this voice that sounded like the water itself. "It taught me everything. Not just fishing, that was only the craft, the tool, the language. Patience. The patience of water that polishes stones, not through force, not through anger, but through time, through 1,000 years of time, through gentleness, through continuity. Respect, deep respect for a force greater than your small force, your human force, which is really just such a small thing in this big world. How to wait without growing impatient. How to sit in a boat for hours, for days, for years, and simply wait, 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 and not think that time is wasted, but that time is invested in understanding, in dialogue, in quiet communication with something greater. How to take without taking. How to take the fish with a feeling of gratitude, not victory, not triumph, but with gratitude, with awareness that I take because this river gives to me. The Danube gives me the fish, and I give the Danube. What do I give her? 34 years of attention, 34 years of gratitude, 34 years of love. I'd like to say, but the word is too big, too common, too small. It's not much what I give, but it's honest, it's true. It comes from the heart. The train accelerated slowly, a gentle increase in speed, and I watched how the river fell behind us, still visible, still golden in the light, but growing smaller, growing more distant, like a memory fading. The water reflected the sun, reflected everything it touched, everything that flowed over it. The window showed me his reflection, or perhaps it wasn't a reflection anymore, but the man himself, already gone, already with his fish, already in the river, where his real life happened, his true life, his only life, where he felt more at home than anywhere else in the world, than in any house, than with any family, than in any city. "I'm getting off at Deggendorf," he said, and stood very slowly, carefully, deliberately, as though the train were working against him, as though time wanted to hold his limbs, as though the train wasn't ready to let him go. "My boat waits there, in the same place where it always waits, where it faithfully waits, impatient, ready, yearning for me. Tomorrow, early, before the sun rises, before the world wakes, I'll go out, and the river will close over me again, like a roof, like an embrace, like hands holding each other, gently, firmly, comfortingly. And I'll be back in my element, in my home, in my truth." The train fell back into the rhythm of the night. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. Slow, sure, regular as a heartbeat. And outside, the Danube flowed, endless, tireless, unstoppable, like a force older than the world, like it has always flowed since time began, and will flow long after I'm dead, long after this man is dead, long after all the trains are gone. I thought of this man who had sunk his whole soul into a river, not as a prison, not as a compulsion, not as fate, but as home, his real home, his only home. And how wise that was, how wise and wonderful and sad and true,
and how he'd understood what many people don't understand in their whole lives, even if they lived 100 years. That work isn't something you do out of necessity or for money or out of duty, but something you become, an identity, something that grows to your name like ivy on a wall, an identity inseparable from your name, your heart, your soul. And slowly, slowly, with the rhythm of the train, with the warmth of the summer night pressing through the windows, warm and sweet and heavy, my eyes grew heavy, heavy as lead, heavy as sleep itself. And I still saw the Danube, even as I no longer saw it, green and golden and flowing and endless, and how it carried me like a thought that carries me into sleep, that carries me home.
I met the Beekeeper on a train through Provence, on the way from Avignon to Manosque. The train passed through a landscape that looked like a painting. Lavender fields stretching as far as the eye could see, in this incredible violet that can't be described, only seen. Interspersed among them were pines, dark green and warm, and stone cottages with shutters in faded blue, and the sky, that Provençal sky that's so high and so clear you feel you could see to the end of the world. She was a woman of about 70, small and sturdy, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of honey, warm and golden and translucent. Her hands were strong, her nails cut short, and around her wrists she wore narrow bracelets of plaited leather. She smelled of lavender and something else, something sweet and warm that I didn't recognize at first. Later, I understood it was beeswax, the smell of an entire life spent among bees. We fell into conversation about the lavender glowing outside in the sun, and she told me about her bees. 50 hives, she said, on a hill above Valensole. 50 families, that's what I call them, because they are families, each with its own character, its own rhythm, its own personality. Some are gentle and calm. Some are wild and impatient. Some hum quietly to themselves, as though singing a song. And some are silent. The silent hives are the ones you have to watch. I asked her what a day looks like when you're a beekeeper, and she smiled, that golden smile, and said, "The day begins with humming. Before the sun rises, I go out to my hives, and I just stand there and listen. The hum of bees at dawn. That's the most beautiful sound in the world. It's not loud, not quiet. It's like the breathing of the earth, like the vibration of something very ancient and very alive. It goes through the ground, through your feet, through your whole body. You feel it more than you hear it." And then, she said, when the sun climbs higher and the air grows warm, they begin to fly out. Thousands of them, from every hive, like little golden specks dancing in the air. They fly to the lavender fields, to the rosemary bushes, to the thyme mats on the stony slopes. Each bee knows exactly where it's going. Each has its own route, its own flower, its own rhythm. They never get lost. They never doubt. They simply know. That's always fascinated me. This certainty. This absolute quiet knowing. She told me how you harvest honey. Not with haste, she said, and not with fear. With calmness, with respect. You approach the hive slowly. You move steadily. You breathe calmly. The bees feel everything. They feel your fear, your rush, your unease. If you're nervous, they get nervous. If you're calm, they're calm. It's like a mirror. They show you who you are in that moment. You can't lie to bees, she said. You can lie to yourself, but not to bees. And the honey, she said, the lavender honey from my hill. It's pale, almost white, and it tastes of summer and wind and the long, warm afternoons of Provence. It crystallizes slowly over weeks and becomes soft and creamy like butter. When I open a jar in December, when it's cold and the bees are sleeping, then the summer is there again, in a spoonful of honey. The whole summer, all the warmth, all the light. That's the miracle of honey. It preserves time. It preserves the summer for the winter. It preserves the light for the darkness. I asked her what the bees had taught her over all those years, and she thought for a while, gazing out the window at the lavender fields slowly disappearing in the evening sun. And then she said, "The bees know when it's time. That's their greatest wisdom. They know when it's time to fly out and when it's time to come home, when it's time to work and when it's time to rest, when it's time to grow and when it's time to swarm. They follow no calendar, no clock, no plan. They follow the rhythm of the world, the rhythm of the blossoms and the sun and the seasons. And they're never wrong. Never." "We humans," she said quietly, "we've forgotten that. We watch clocks and calendars and to-do lists. We rush and plan and organize. But the bees, they simply know. They sense when the lavender will bloom before it blooms. They sense when the rain is coming before the clouds appear. They sense when winter's approaching and gather exactly as much honey as they need. Not more, not less. Exactly right. Always exactly right." She got off at a little station whose name sounded like a poem, took her bag, and went into the evening sun, into the golden light of Provence. And I imagined her walking up the hill to her 50 families waiting for her, humming, warm, patient, the way they always wait. The bees know when it's time. I think of that when I'm impatient, when I'm trying to force something that's not yet ready, when I'm rushing when I should be walking. Then I hear, in my memory, the humming, that deep, warm humming that goes through the ground and through the feet and through your whole body. The train carries on, and I sink deeper into the cushions. The rattle's like humming now, quiet and warm and steady, like 50 hives on a hill in Provence, like the breathing of the earth. My eyes grow heavy, and I let myself hum and be carried into the silence, into the warm, golden silence. The route from Weinheim to Bensheim in September is not a historic route, not a famous route you'll find in guidebooks, not a route people write poems about, not a route the great travelers take, the celebrities who fill the history books. But it has a scent, a fragrance, a breath that overcomes everything else, that makes you forget everything else, that makes everything else unimportant. And that's what makes it special. What makes it unforgettable. What makes it sacred, in a quiet way. It's the scent of orchard meadows, of the meadows where fruit has grown for decades, where apples and pears fall, rot, return to the soil. When the fruit falls in this September, when everything becomes too ripe, when the time comes, when the light begins to turn, when the sweetness becomes overripe, overdue, overflowing, and begins to ferment, to transform into something else, something more complex, something stronger, something that belongs to nature, not to humans, who can't control it, who can't stop it. The train travels slowly through this part of the country, not because it must, not because of rules or schedules or time pressure, but because the way is winding, branched, full of small villages, full of history, full of life that's quiet, that isn't rushed. And because there's not much here that's urgent, that lives by hectic pace, that has to be fast, that tugs, that pushes. And I sit with my window open, just a bit, just enough that the air comes in, that the scent streams in, that the night touches me. And I breathe this September scent, this one scent, this one smell that can hold a whole life, that's almost a whole life. Apples, pears, the damp grass beneath them, the dew damp, carrying morning dew, collecting all night. The damp wood of the old trees, the wood moisture, containing time, containing decades, containing patience, containing love. There's no drama here. There's no story I could tell of a particular person, of a fate, of a turn, of a conflict, of a resolution. Because there's no particular person, no character with a name, no dialogue, no plot. There's only me, and the scent, and the feeling that this moment is complete, that this moment is enough, that this moment is everything, that more isn't necessary. Everything I need, everything a person needs to live, to exist, to be satisfied, sits in this moment, breathes in this moment, beats in this moment. The train is a feeling, is not just a means of transport, not just mechanical movement, is a feeling of movement and safety, of holding and traveling at once. The meadows are scent, are not just fields, not just nature, our memory made of fragrance, our history made of molecules, our past, present, and future made of breath. The night is still warm, surprisingly warm despite the late summer, despite hints of ending, of cold, of winter, of frost and snow coming. And everything smells of ending, but not frighteningly, not darkly, but peacefully, gently, naturally, rightly, like everything living smells when it ends, when it prepares for sleep, for return, for transformation, for new beginning in another form. I think of all the people living in this part of the world, in houses far from the track, 100 meters away, kilometers away, sitting in their houses, lying in their beds, living their lives, and yet still hearing the train when it passes, when it chugs and snorts on this route, when it cuts the air with its presence, with its sound. And I think, That's my train. That's my sound. That's my night. That's my scent. That's my moment. That's my life. And for them, it's normal, is every day. It's something they no longer notice, that they've stopped hearing, that they've suppressed. That's part of the soundscape of their childhood, something they no longer consciously perceive. They've grown accustomed to it, adapted to it, accepted it as part of their reality, their normalcy. But for me who only passes through here, only on this one night, in this one September, in this one year, on this one route, on this one journey, for me, this is completely extraordinary, is a gift that never belonged to me, is a revelation, is almost grace, is blessing. The apples fall. I can hear them, distinctly, carefully, loud in my ears, louder almost than the train, than the wheels. The apples fall from the trees, fall from their time above to the time below. The gentle, barely audible landing on the damp earth. Not loud, not dramatic, not violent, but rhythmic, regular, reliable. Like a metronome, like a clock counting time, like a heart beating. Apple after apple, pear after pear. It's as though the trees are saying, in a voice older than words, now is the time. Now let it go. Now let loose. Now trust. And that's the only imperative here, the only truth, the only voice that speaks, that drowns out all other voices, that overcomes all other truth. September says, it's time to fall. It's time to let go. It's time to become something else, something new, something nature needs. And everything falls. Everything lets go. Everything trusts the process, the great process, the eternal process. Everything surrenders. I sit longer than I need to, keep the window open, though Bedtime approaches, though lights begin to appear, though the normal world knocks. I sit and breathe and let the scent penetrate me. Let it fill me. Let it become my flesh, become my blood. I think of the trees, of generations of trees that have stood here, that have given apples, that have given pears, year after year, century after century. I think of the people who picked these fruits, generation after generation, of the hands that picked them, of the hands that carried juice and sweetness, of the lips that tasted them, of the children who ate these fruits. And I sit here, in this train, in this night, and I'm part of this chain, part of this story, part of this continuity. I'm a witness. I'm a keeper of this memory. Bedtime approaches, comes visibly closer. The lights of the city begin to blink on the horizon. The platform becomes visible, becomes real. The window closes again, slowly. My hand pulls it shut, because the station nears, because the city nears, and with it civilization, lights, people, the normal world. But this scent still sits on my clothes, penetrates them, lives in the fibers, in my hair, between the strands, deep in my lungs, in the alveoli, in my blood almost. September sits now in me, is part of me, is my memory. And I'll carry it with me, carry it inside me, until I forget it. Or perhaps hopefully, until I travel this route again, until the next September comes, until the apples fall again, until everything repeats itself, new and old at once. And for now the meadows are dark, dark as the night itself, dark as a secret, and the apples grow softer, become matter, become humus, become earth again, become dust, become history. The night grows older and warmer still somehow, grows fuller, grows deeper, reaches for me, and my eyes, they grow so heavy, so tired, so blessed with tiredness. And the scent carries me away, carries me forth, away from this September, away from this moment, away from this reality, away from this night that's also a dream, that's also a memory, into a dream that also smells of apples, that also smells of pears, that also smells of earth, that also smells of ending, of transformation, of grace, that is so sweet, so overripe, so ready, so complete, so fulfilled. The sound of the wheels has a very special tone today. Not steady like usual, but a bit irregular, a slight arrhythmia, a stumble almost, a heart skip of the rails. And that immediately reminds me of an older gentleman I met on the route from Saarbrücken to Trier many years ago, perhaps 30 years ago, in a time when the world was still different. He sat with a ticket in his hand, older than some of my memories, from 1952, stamped, colorless from time, an artifact almost, a relic from another epoch, a testament to journeys he had taken, or a journey that was meaningful to him. "That was my first journey," he said, thoughtfully, as though remembering a love. "From here to here. But back then the world was still bigger. The distance was bigger, the time was bigger, the hope was bigger." He had been a railwayman, 50 years long, almost his whole life, an entire existence devoted. Not a driver, not a conductor, not on the train. He was the man who kept the rails in order, who maintained the track, who watched over the lifeblood of the system. The man who stood guard over all these connections, over thousands of kilometers, over the iron arteries of the nation, so they wouldn't someday collapse under the weight of millions of tons of steel and human will and time. "You see," he said, leaning closer, as though telling me a secret, "a track is like a body, like a human body, alive and mortal. You can't see it from the outside, not immediately, not at first glance. But if you know how to look, if you take the time for it, you can see whether it's growing old, whether it's growing weary, whether it's growing ill, whether it's beginning to suffer silently without complaint, whether it'll soon collapse, fall apart, can no longer hold." And he showed me his notebook, decades old, the pages dark from weather and work, almost dark brown from rain, from sun, from sweat, full of notes, handwritten, years of observations. Crack at kilometer 47. Rust at the joint, gets worse with the years. Beam needs replacing, soon, before everything breaks. All handwritten, carefully, all the observations of a man who really looked,
who saw the rails as alive, as breathing, as speaking.
I asked him, slowly, carefully, what happened when he retired, when those 50 years finally ended. And he was silent for a long time, very long. The rattle of the wheels was the only sound. Then he said, quietly, I went mad. The first year. That was the worst year of my life. More intense, heavier. I woke every morning and didn't know what to do, where to go, who I was without the rails. My hands didn't know what to do, were empty, useless, restless. Because for 50 years they knew exactly. We go to the trackbed, we check, millimeter by millimeter. We repair, we maintain. That was the grammar of my life. And then, nothing. Silence. A silence that killed, almost, slowly. A bit more every day. But then, and it was strange that this was strange, that my body led me ahead of my mind, that instincts are older than reason, he began to travel. By train. Simply to travel, like a patient, like a passenger, not like a worker, not like a supervisor. Every week a new route, he told me, and it was longing and healing mixed in his voice, was hope and sorrow mixed, was pain and joy. I get on a train and travel somewhere, everywhere, without plan, without goal, simply travel. From Saarbrücken to Nuremberg, from Hanover to Stuttgart, from Munich to Hamburg, everywhere, everywhere. And as I sat and looked out the window, I realized that I still see the rails, will still see them forever. I could see where I'd worked in my life, where my hands had been, where my heart had been, where my tears had fallen. I could say, I laid a new rail here 30 years ago, after the war, when I was young and strong. And here, that was a difficult spot where I needed almost a week, sweating, bleeding almost, with pain in every muscle, to fix the joint, to heal the break, to keep the system alive. The rails are like autobiography, he said, and I heard in his words a deep truth, a realization that took a whole life to become. My autobiography is everywhere beneath us. Everywhere on this continent. Every rail, every nail, every repair, every night under the moon, every hour under the sun. My hands are in them, live in them. When I travel over my own life, my own story, my own love, my own work. And that is more than I could ever have hoped for at the end of my life, in this new time of rest, when everything is still, when the hands can finally find peace, when memory becomes everything. I saw him sitting there, this old man with his scarred hands and his precious notebook, and I suddenly understood absolutely that he hadn't really grown old. No, that's not right. Time aged around him, wrapped itself around him like a coat, adjusted him. But he himself, his essence, his heart, is timeless, almost immortal, if such a thing can be said. He still sits in the trackbed, still checks the rails with his eyes, with his knowledge, still repairs the break points, the weak spots. But now he does it with his whole body, with his whole life, with the train as his tool, the route as his notebook, his autobiography made of steel and time. And I understood that this is the highest form of circularity, the highest form of love, the highest form of fulfillment, when what you created ends up carrying you, holding you, embracing you, doesn't let you go, never lets you go. He fell asleep slowly, his head tilted to the side. The notebook lay on his lap, protective, important. And the train continued through the landscape of the Saarland, through a history, through a biography made of steel. And I sat and listened to the wheels. And yes, I could hear distinctly where the rails were older, where the scars were, where someone, perhaps he himself 30 years ago, had had to work, had had to suffer, had had to sacrifice. And it was as though the track itself spoke to me, in a language made of rhythm and tone, of vibrations and truth, and said with every rail, "A man stood here. He watched over this track. He made sure we could travel safely, that these wheels wouldn't jump the rails, that this journey wouldn't end in chaos and blood." Trier drew closer. The city cooled us a bit. The train began to slow. The rhythm changed, became narrower, became limited, became less free. And he woke up, slowly, gently. His eye opened. His old hand grasped the notebook, protective, loving. And he gathered his few things together, arranged them carefully, stood up slowly, pain visible in his knees and back, and left the train without fanfare, without goodbye, without a word, simply gone, back into his life on the rails. But I could see his notebook briefly, through a brief, important glance into his life, and in it was written, in finest ink, in handwriting that was a whole life, a handwriting vibrating with love, a life story written not in words, not in tales, not in sentences, but in numbers, in millimeters, in rust spots and new rails, in notes and dates, in an archive of care and love, of watchfulness and devotion. A life that sits beneath the feet of all travelers, everywhere, always, invisible, unforgotten, alive, waiting. And now I still sometimes travel this route. Travel between Saarbrücken and Trier. Travel over his life. Travel over the work of his hands. And I try to hear what he heard, what he always heard. The voices of the rails, the story beneath me, the voices of all the men who built the rails, repaired them, loved them. My eyes grow heavy from this listening, from this trying, heavy as lead, heavy as love. The night grows deeper, grows older, grows more familiar, and I slowly sink into this autobiography made of steel and memory, made of sacrifice and love, made of hands that worked, slowly becoming safer, until I myself become part of the rail, part of his story, part of this infinite network of work and time.